off. It's quite entertaining.
It's what now?
It's entertaining, whoever is saying stuff in the background.
Okay, so today we're going to begin our discussions about each of the 13 disability categories that is recognized by IDEA. The structure of our talks and of kind of these slides essentially mirrors the structure of the chapter in the textbook that corresponds to the presentation. They do a good job of kind of laying out all of the information that you as special educators should be aware of in regards to these different disability categories. So we're just going to go ahead and follow the order presented in the book, and they start off with intellectual disabilities. So we've learned a bit about intellectual disabilities already. We talked about mental retardation a lot. We talked about kind of these very archaic diagnostic categories of moron and imbecile and feeble-mindedness. And as you recall, these were the early descriptors that, were given to people that today would be more than likely identified as having an intellectual disability. So today we'll talk about how is intellectual disability diagnosed? What are like the different levels of intellectual disability? We'll talk about some of the causes or factors that are believed to figure into causing intellectual disability in an individual. We will talk about different types of assessments that are used. We will talk about some best practices for serving students in the classroom with intellectual disabilities. And as always, as we go through this material, when you have questions, feel free just to blurt out your question. So, real quickly, do you all work with individuals with intellectual disabilities?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh.
And so, what would you say are some of the challenges about working with students with intellectual disabilities? Anyone can go.
Well, like one specifically has other disabilities outside of just being ID.
Okay.
So I would say just having someone who's so much lower than maybe others in special education. It's hard to group students together if you have to, because the level of their cognitive ability
is kind of so different than the other students that you're working
so like maybe a student who has ASD, and then you have someone with, or kiddo with ID, and it's really hard to kind of set up programming for them.
Right. Anyone else have a similar experience or a different experience or perspective?
For myself, it takes them a little bit longer to learn. So I would have to reteach them multiple things many times in order for them to understand it.
Right. So it can be a bit more taxing in that regard. You have to be more repetitive.
And I think it depends on their level too.
Right. We have everything from like mild to profound intellectual disability, and so
So I was kind of talking of more profound.
Say that again, Crystal.
Profound, which is a lot different. You're not really doing academics per se, so more life skills.
Right. And you know what? So when I was teaching at a community college, it was in the Tools for Transition and Work program. And so this program was for students with disabilities who have graduated high school, who were, independent enough to be on a junior college campus. And so the classes, the program that they were in, the classes that I taught were all related to, vocational development. So we would do group work, just because one thing that I very quickly learned in that program is that it doesn't really matter what the content is that I was teaching. Oftentimes the biggest learning opportunities came from just putting these groups of students together and asking them to work toward a shared goal. So, working as functional teams. And, I had students who were, very high functioning with autism, people who are, much higher functioning with just, a specific learning disability, and who would get very frustrated when they were paired with a student who had, like mild to moderate intellectual disability. And I don't know if, any of you have ever experienced that kind of in grouping students in that way.
I've experienced it in elementary, where the student with ASD and I think he had emotional disturbance as well, or PTSD, I can't remember exactly, he gets really mad and hates being around students that are nonverbal.
Okay.
So also ID, but then nonverbal, and it would make him really angry. So he couldn't be in the same classrooms with.
Right. I know that my students, they always felt that like they were doing all the work, and so that it was unfair, and it was a very kind of challenging, dynamic to work through, and trying to kind of achieve a level of a peaceful coexistence between the members of the group. So
I struggle sometimes with
go ahead.
confidence
Sorry,
level.
Colby, go ahead.
Confidence level in a regular ed, either mixed in with other regular ed kids, and I have regular ed classes during the day with special ed, and just their confidence level, believing in themselves, believing they're just as good as other kids.
So you're saying that they do have high levels of confidence, or they do not?
They do not.
Yes. And we'll talk a bit about that, and the chapter talked about that too, this kind of idea of learned helplessness, that basically because of their, set of previous experiences in which they've been kind of unsuccessful in kind of academic, activities, that they, they take that information into account in all future attempts to do things, and come away with a very kind of negative perspective on their ability to be successful, which really isn't true. And there are some strategies that can be implemented to kind of help these students, who are experiencing these situations, to work through those negative mindsets. Okay, so let's talk prevalence. So to begin, there are many factors that contribute to, difficulties in kind of estimating the number of people with intellectual disabilities. When we talk about like autism, it seems to be the case that kind of their estimates are more confident, they're more specific. Certainly when we're talking about intellectual disability, it does encompass kind of a range, students who are, basically impacted, from a very profound sense down to a very mild sense. But certainly there have been changing definitions of intellectual disability. I've read that schools might be reluctant to label children with mild intellectual impairments, and the changing status of school children with mild intellectual disabilities. As you may have recalled in the readings, that some students who do have a mild intellectual disability can actually, they can lose the requirement for special education services. And so they're certainly capable of learning and progressing in their educational careers. Some fairly recent data, 2012 to 2013, about 430,000 students received special education services from IDEA under the intellectual disability diagnosis. And this is about 6.7% of all children in special education. I think, as is the case with like many disabilities, we do see variance between states. And here were just two examples that the textbook provided. A very low prevalence in the state of Maine, less than 1%, on up to 2.18% in Virginia. So it seems like there are some inconsistencies with kind of how the disability might be diagnosed, and inconsistencies in terms of the fidelity with which the rates are reported. And when we think about intellectual disability in the context of IDEA, it's the fifth largest category. And you see there those that come before it. 4, learning disabilities, speech language impairments, other health impairments, and autism.
Do you think that the low number in Maine is just from them not reporting it and not labeling children, or do you think that's something else?
I mean, it could be. Yeah, it could be that in some states, students are differentially diagnosed. They're given a different diagnosis. We talked about this idea of diagnostic substitution last week. Remember when I showed you that graph that kind of showed the dramatic decrease in the number of students with intellectual disabilities served by IDEA, accompanied by that dramatic increase of students with autism who are served by IDEA. So yeah, so it could be that maybe some states, are more interested in diagnosing those kind of borderline cases. The student might be, have a profound intellectual disability, or the student might be, level 3 autism spectrum disorder. And that could have to do with funding, because I think that, the funding mechanisms based on the counts of different types of students, given the kinds of supports that they require, are different. So that also could be a factor that plays into kind of why we see this variance. Causes, of course, we're always interested in what are the causes of disabilities when we're, in an introductory level course such as this one. As we'll see, this is kind of similar to the case of autism. More than 350 risk factors have been identified. And again, just because one child, possesses one of these risk factors and ends up with a diagnosis of ID, doesn't necessarily mean that a different child with the same risk factor is going to end up with an ID diagnosis. About 35% of cases have a genetic factor. External trauma or environmental toxins have been associated with about a third of the cases, according to our textbook. And then there is at least a third of cases that the etiology, the cause is unknown. But when we're dealing with we're dealing with conditions that are pervasive in the sense that they impact a broad range of systems in an individual. Chances are that it's not just one thing. It's a combination of both biological and environmental factors, in concert with maybe other risk factors within children.
I was gonna say too, I know two separate kids with CP, and one is really intelligent and the other is nonverbal and ID.
Okay.
So it's interesting because I know CP is a factor in ID.
Cerebral palsy, yes.
Yeah. So that's kind of interesting. But.
No, good. Thank you for bringing that up.
Mm-hmm.
So, how does the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act define intellectual disability? Significantly sub-average general intellectual functioning. And this is an important part of the definition. Existing concurrently with deficits and adaptive behavior, and manifested during the developmental period that adversely affects a child's educational performance. So the key here is that there needs to be this kind of deficit in intellectual functioning that leads to deficits in a number of different adaptive behaviors, and we'll talk about what those specific behaviors are as we move through some of the slides. So it's not just intellectual ability. It's got to be intellectual ability coupled with these deficits in adaptive behavior. And just as a quick check-in, what is adaptive behavior? Adaptive behavior is behavior that what?
You want to adapt to the situation?
Right. And by situation, what do you mean?
Environment.
Well, their environment, their
Right.
disabilities, whatever they can. Yeah.
Essentially, life, right?
Like being able to take care of themselves.
Say that again?
Being able to take care of themselves.
Yeah, that's a good example. Social skills, exactly. Functional skills, functional writing, functional reading, just any of the behaviors that are necessary to achieve some level of independence in life. And so there are 3 criteria required for a diagnosis of intellectual disability. Can anyone think of one of those criteria?
Significantly sub-average general intellectual functioning. So it's significant equals a score of 2 or more. So it's 70. Wait.
But 2 or more what? You forgot an important term.
I know. I think I got tired of writing.
A deviation.
A deviation.
Oh, standard deviation.
Standard deviation. That's exactly right.
I put the dots. I just didn't.
2 or more standard deviations below the mean on a standardized intelligence test.
Yes. And
So that
70
means-
or less.
Yeah, an IQ of 70 or less. And we already talked about the second one too. What is the second criteria?
Must also have significant difficulty with tasks of everyday living, which is adaptive behavior.
Adaptive behavior, good. And lastly, there's a third one.
A deficit in intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior must occur during the developmental period to help distinguish ID from their disabilities. So impaired intellectual performance caused by TBI was one of them.
Right. So basically, this criteria is requiring that it kind of be present early on, right?
Mhm.
If somebody is a professional snowboarder and, goes off a huge quarter pipe and experiences traumatic brain injury, they're not going to be diagnosed with intellectual disability, even if that injury kind of resulted in a profile of challenges that was consistent with intellectual disability. And so lastly, the child who exhibits these limitations in intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior will meet IDEA's requirement that the disability adversely affects a child's educational performance. And then the book talked about the classification, so like the 4 different levels, and these are just kind of based on the IQ scores. And so we see mild, 50 to 55 to 70. So 70 is that 2 standard deviations away from the mean. So 70 is 2 standard deviations away from the mean. What is the mean if the standard deviation is 15?
85.
Well, wouldn't it be 100?
Wait, so hang on. You said standard deviation of 15?
Right. So 2 standard deviations would be 30 points away from the mean. Right?
Yeah. I thought you just said 1. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, 2. And then moderate 35 to 40 to 50 to 55. So there's, these aren't very clear cut points. Severe from 20 to 25 to 35 to 40, and then profound intellectual disability is below 25. So that would be 5 standard deviations away from the mean, which is a very, very, very small number of people. And I have a slide that kind of shows what that normal distribution looks like. And so we can see kind of the percentage of the population that we would expect to find at these different levels of intellectual disability. And so certainly these descriptors are still applied. But again, it's not just the IQ score. It's also based on their classification of the person's adaptive behavior. And that's just a point that we'll continue to reiterate. Because certainly there are people who have low IQs who are perfectly capable of, taking care of themselves and living independently. So that's not enough.
I also saw something in there that said that it's like at the time of the assessment, basically. So like just because a student had been qualified or classified as ID, like upon the next, not assessment, I can't remember what the right word is right now. Upon the next time that you get tested for ID, they have to, it has to be with right now. They can't use the results from the last time they were assessed, because in some cases, people with an intellectual disability are capable of learning things in order to no longer be qualified as having an intellectual disability, which I found was really interesting.
Right. So a student, and they talked about kind of, especially students in that range of about 70, right? Kind of the mild intellectual disability, or those who are kind of most capable, or who most frequently are able to basically, lose the diagnosis.
Yeah, I have a student, and his ID classification, his ID results came back at he was 72, but he's still qualified under ID. And the more I'm working with him, the more I'm seeing improvements on all of his abilities. And I'm curious what's going to happen in the future when he gets his 3-year reeval, if he'll qualify or if he'll have learned those adaptive skills to be able to move on to more like a resource type class.
Right. Well, hopefully that is the case.
It'd be pretty cool. I think he'd be happy about that.
Yeah, no, it's a huge accomplishment. Right, and so basically this whole shift away from, because as we'll recall, it used to just be the IQ test when we're talking about, the treatment of people with mental retardation, in the early 19th century. It was just the IQ test. But the shift to emphasizing the importance of adaptive behavior is because, we need to have a way to determine what types and levels of supports a person needs. And just knowing what someone's IQ is doesn't really give us that information. It's not going to give us the kind of information that we would need in order to help such an individual learn kind of the functional skills or the academic skills that they're going to need to be successful. And so we need to have this other component. We know of the inexactness of intelligence testing, Becca, you were mentioning, you didn't mention this specifically, but taking an IQ test is just like, it's a one-shot thing, There are many factors that could, contribute to why, you performed poorly on that IQ test. Maybe you were tired. Maybe, you had a stressful week at school. Maybe, the lights in the room were too bright. Maybe you had a proctor who was especially strict. Maybe somebody was, wearing a lot of perfume or cologne and it was really bothering you and you couldn't concentrate, right? These are just kind of like one, they're kind of like shots in the arm. It's just kind of an in and out. Just because you score at one level on an IQ test during a given administration does not mean that you will necessarily get that same score where you test it again. Of course, tests like the Wechsler IQ test and the Stanford Binet IQ test, they're said to be reliable. And does anyone know what it means for a test to be reliable? Have you heard this term?
I think so.
Yeah, a test is reliable if it consistently measures what it says it's going to measure. So yeah, generally, when they develop these tests and, they're, performing all their kind of psychometric analyses to determine the reliability and the validity of the test. For a lot of people, it is reliable. You take it, at the beginning of, you take it in 1999 in January, you take it in 1999 of December, chances are you might get a very similar score, but that's not always the case for all the people.
Yeah, sorry. I was just gonna, whoever was talking about that student moving into resource, it says on here, IQ scores can change significantly. So it's something that you'd have to reevaluate.
Right.
Exactly.
And maybe before that 3-year mark.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, a parent could request a reevaluation if they're seeing, growth in their child. Absolutely. And then lastly, the importance of clinical judgment in diagnosis and classification. Clinical judgment is basically judgment made by a school psychologist. And certainly they are the prominent individuals who are making these diagnoses and classifications. And so by including the adaptive component, there kind of is more of a role for this individual to make a judgment and classification, because they're dealing with more information than just a number. Okay, so we're going to move on. As we're going to see, IQ tests, you know, they are an important, they're half of the means by which ID is diagnosed. But we're going to see that they're not the best tests, and there are, you know, people have you know, spoken and written very critically of them, and their role in you know, being used to develop any kind of classification system. So IQ tests, these are administered by school psychologists, and they, you know, they're the kind of tests that you have to be professionally trained to administer. Myself, and I'm assuming that no one of you are qualified to administer IQ tests. And they consist of test questions that can be categorized kind of within a few different domains. Vocabulary questions, conceptual similarity questions. These are just a couple you know, examples of the types of questions that you might see on an IQ test. Problem-solving tests, so kind of like spatial memory, being able to solve mazes, complete block designs. And then, you know, items that are testing memory, and then other types of questions that are assumed to require certain degrees of intelligence. Assumed to require certain degrees of intelligence. And generally, the types of intelligence that they are assumed to require are the kinds of intelligence required to solve the test questions. This intelligence does not necessarily, you know, translate out into the real world. But certainly, this intelligence is required to pass the, you know, IQ test questions. So in a sense, you know, kind of one of a very kind of broad level critique of IQ tests is that, well, an IQ test measures what an IQ test measures, and that's it. Like, we can't see a thing called intelligence. You know, certainly we some people might have more knowledge than others, but intelligence as it is conceptualized, and the kinds of tests that are used in this case for, you know, identifying intellectual disability have been created just for that particular reason. Another important aspect of an IQ test is that it is standardized. Does anyone know what that means? A standardized test?
Same, like everyone takes the same one.
Right. Everyone takes the same test, which has the same questions on it. The test is always presented in the same way, and it is always scored using the same procedure every single time, right? And so that is supposed to give strength to the test, right? By doing it this way, what, you know, what these, what is trying to be avoided is the intrusion of factors unrelated to the knowledge the test is purported to tap into, that are going to kind of contribute to error variance in the score. So if I gave one of you an IQ test, you know, in a classroom, sitting all by yourself with you know, no extraneous noises and only a number 2 pencil, and I sat at the front of the table, you know, the front of the room the whole time, Well, that's not going to be the same as if I gave, your friend the test and said, oh, just go home and do this at home, right? Now that test is no longer standardized. We can't say that we can compare these results because we've kind of upset this, this notion of standardization. Also, they are norm referenced. Does anyone know what this means?
Correct answers are based on the answers provided by a large group of people.
Exactly right, exactly right. Administered to a large sample of people selected at random from the population for whom the test is intended. And interestingly, with an IQ test and with any test that has, been shown to be valid and reliable, if you give it to enough people, the scores will form a distribution, which is known as the bell-shaped curve or the normal distribution. And then we talked about the standard deviation. So generally, we would have a lot of people kind of grouped kind of around the mean, and then as we went out into the tails, we would see fewer and fewer people kind of scoring in those areas. And standard deviations kind of give us, basically standardized kind of distances away from that mean. And here's what that looks like. I'm sure that this is a review for most of you. You can see that roughly with any sample, with any test, if you give a valid and reliable test to enough people, you generally will get this distribution of results. So about, 68% of the sample will fall between one standard deviation of the mean, either in this case above or below, in this case above. 95% of the people will fall between or within two standard deviations of the mean. And as we get further and further out into the tails, this is where we start to see, the scores really start to drop off. So less than 2% of people will fall, let's see, within three standard deviations of the mean. And so significant limitations of intellectual functioning are associated with an IQ score approximately 2 SDs below the mean. So a mean of 70 on this test here, a score of 70. So kind of right here. A score of 75 or more may also be associated with an ID if it's based on a clinician's judgment, or if the child exhibits deficits in adaptive behavior thought to be caused by impaired intellectual functioning. So there still can be these cases in which a student might, not score below that level of 70 and still receive a diagnosis of intellectual disability. So just a bit more on IQ tests. They are useful for objectively identifying deficits in cognitive functioning. And they do bear strong relationships and are predictors of school achievement. And this seems pretty reasonable because they're composed largely of, verbal and academic tasks, the kinds of things that we're, asked to perform when we're in school. And so it correlates highly with school achievement. It might not be the same thing as school achievement, but generally people who do better on an IQ test tend to do better in school in terms of achievement. But they're not foolproof, and I alluded to this already. I mentioned that intelligence is a hypothetical construct. And does anyone recall what I meant when I said that? I said that intelligence is not something that what?
You can see.
Right. It's not like height. Height is not a hypothetical construct. We can see with our, with our own eyes, variation in height. We can see with our own eyes variations in, the distance that somebody can throw a baseball or hit a golf ball. Intelligence is something completely different. We can't see that. And so we infer it from an observed performance, right? So if our test is in some way flawed, then we are making a terrible error in saying that we are able to kind of infer, somebody's ability on that test, whatever that test may be. These IQ tests, the Wechsler and the Stanford-Binet, I mean, they have undergone so many, just high degrees of psychometric scrutiny. So they're pretty good. They wouldn't kind of fall victim to this issue that I just alluded to. And then I already alluded to this. An IQ test is basically a sample of a kid's performance at a single point in time. And there are a number of factors that could play into, a child not performing as well on such a test as she or he, might be capable of doing at some other point in time. IQ can change significantly. We talked about this as well. And particularly in this kind of mild, in this range where people are considered to be mildly intellectually disabled, where diagnostic decisions are not so clear-cut. At this range of IQ, it might not be the right decision to make a diagnosis, because this is certainly an area in which, relative to people who have, severe or profound intellectual disability, are actually capable of learning and achieving academic growth. It's not an exact science, okay? It's not just one's level of intelligence that impacts one's IQ score. And I mentioned some of these already. Motivation, time and location of the test. These tests are timed. For many students, knowing that you are working under a time constraint can create anxiety, and that anxiety can impact your, performance on the test. And so this is just kind of, but then again, if we want the test to be standardized, we have to hold everybody to the same requirements. And, time is one of those requirements. They make you put down your pencil after the allotted amount of time to take the test has transpired. We have different IQ tests. We have the Stanford-Binet, we have the Wechsler IQ test. These are both tests that are reported to measure IQ, but they're not exactly the same. So in this sense, IQ is not just a single thing. There are as many types of IQ as there are tests that were developed to test IQ. We talked briefly about how IQ tests can be culturally biased because, again, many of these tests were normed on samples of white middle-class children, and for students and individuals who did not grow up, who were not raised, in that kind of demographic, well, the test will not be fair. And lastly, we never use an IQ test as a sole basis for making a decision about intellectual disability. It's just one component of a multi-factored, non-discriminatory assessment suite. One other thing. We never use IQ tests to determine IEP objectives. Like, I'm assuming that none of you have ever seen an IEP goal that, that Joey is going to increase his intelligence quotient by 15 points by the end of the academic school year, right? That does not make sense.
It's not measurable, and it's far-fetched.
Absolutely. Right? When we're thinking about IEP goals and the kinds of instruments that we should be using to develop those goals and those benchmarks, those objectives, we want curriculum-based knowledge and skills assessments. We don't want these kind of like, these very kind of abstract IQ tests being used to inform the development of those goals. Okay, so we talked a bit about IQ tests. We have a few more minutes before break. I'd like to jump into adaptive behavior assessments, right? Because this is the other component of an intellectual disability diagnosis. So we've talked about adaptive behavior already. Basically, the stuff that we need to be able to do to function in our everyday lives. They include, our textbook classifies them as conceptual, social, and practical skills. Can anyone recall what an example of a conceptual skill is?
Reading, writing.
Yeah. Using language for speaking, number concepts required for counting and telling time. The next category is social. This should be a pretty easy one. What was one of the examples that the textbook provided us?
Getting along with others.
There you go. Solving social problems, following rules and obeying laws, avoiding being victimized by other people. And then lastly, practical skills. And these are just the kind of nuts and bolts of independence, daily living activities, being able to get dressed and use the restroom and prepare food, the ability to learn basic job skills, traveling throughout the community, following schedules, maintaining one's health and safety, making purchases, using the phone, etc. This is not an exhaustive list. There are many different practical skills.
It should say hygiene.
What's that?
It should say hygiene.
Right, hygiene. I guess we could make the argument that we could qualify hygiene under health, although it's not a strong argument. If one is unhygienic, one might assume that that person could also be unhealthy. But no, you're right. Hygiene should definitely be a specific one. And again, it is the level of adaptive skill that a person with an intellectual disability has, which is the critical factor in determining the supports that that person is going to need for success in the community, at home, in school. Remember, the IQ score in and of itself tells us nothing. There are a number of different adaptive behavior assessments. The adaptive behavior scale, which focuses on school. This is one example that the textbook provided us. It consists of 2 parts. Part 1, 10 domains related to independent functioning and daily living skills. Part 2, an assessment of an individual's level of maladaptive behaviors in 7 areas. And a few examples are trustworthiness, self-abusive behavior, social engagement. A diagnostic adaptive behavior scale, an assessment that is valid for individuals as young as 4 and on up to 21 years of age. And again, this scale includes a cutoff point at which an individual is considered to have significant limitations in adaptive behavior. And we learned a bit about cutoff points last week, right? What is an important consideration to keep in mind when placing the cutoff point?
Making them similar to or the same as the cutoff points in IDEA,
True.
like 21.
Right. No, I'm talking about the cutoff point, like on this. So, like, if you're below this score, you have a significant limitation in adaptive behavior. If you're above this score, you do not.
Oh, I thought you meant the 21-year cutoff.
Oh, no, sorry. Right. I was just unclear.
Different question.
Right. So these cutoff points shouldn't be, so strict that, that they miss a lot of people who actually do have significant limitations in adaptive behavior, right? We don't want a cutoff point that only catches, like, the top 2% of individuals with, who are most significantly limited in their adaptive behavior. Well, at the same time, we don't want to have the cutoff point placed at such a low point on the scale that, the person who comes to, school with some oatmeal on their shirt is considered to have a limitation in adaptive behavior because they can't, keep themselves clean or can't do laundry. So it's just one of the points that Haslam made in that article that we read on the first day of class. So we'll look at this last example of an instrument here, and then we'll take our break because we're coming up on 6 o'clock. And so this is a kind of a different type of scale. It includes 244 test questions, and these are typically completed by a teacher or a school support staff. And one of the issues here, one of the challenges, is the relative nature of social adjustment and competence, to the extent that it makes measurement of adaptive behavior difficult. And that's because, actions considered appropriate in one situation or by one group may not be in another situation or by another group. So, it's perfectly fine for me to, sit on my couch in my sweatpants, eating ice cream and spilling it all over myself and just looking, kind of sloppy over the weekend. And it's a complete another situation if I'm, showing up to my job looking that same way.
Wearing the same shirt with ice cream.
Exactly. So you need to, and again, this is completed by a teacher or a school support staff. And so teachers and other, people working at schools, they kind of have their own biases. And so, they might consider something that a student does to be, maladaptive, whereas, a different rater who is less severe might be okay with that behavior. So it's kind of a challenge with these informant completed assessments. Typically, we would want to do observation-based assessments where we, actually shadow the person and we just kind of watch what the person does in their day-to-day life and make our decisions based off of those. But we're going to stop there. When we come back, we're going to go into some of the characteristics of intellectual disability. But so for now, let's just meet back here at 6:12. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Let us go ahead and resume our investigation of intellectual disability. So now we'll go into some of the characteristics of intellectual disability, as I indicated before the break. Speaking first in some generalities, intellectual disability is a condition that affects most people throughout their lifespans. You know, certainly it is possible for people with this diagnosis to, you know, make advancements in, you know, adaptive living skills or academic skills. It is definitely possible for people who are more mildly affected to live independently or to function independently. And in the context of, you know, school, K through 12, it is possible that a student with a mild form of intellectual disability no longer be served under any disability category. Looking specifically at mild intellectual disability, this is a condition that is generally not identified until around grade 2. And this is because at this point in one's educational career, the work expected of us becomes more challenging. It starts drawing on, you know, greater capacity for memory, a greater capacity for working memory, holding, you know, multiple pieces of information and in mind at once to solve problems, etc. Individuals with mild intellectual disability, you know, are perfectly capable of learning basic skills in a variety of domains, daily living, vocational, academic. And as I already mentioned, as they move into adulthood, it's certainly possible for individuals who are mildly affected, who have a mild intellectual disability, to live independently or at least semi-independently. So by semi-independently, I mean, you know, living for the most part on one's own, but having like a life coach who will, you know, set up regular appointments to just kind of make sure that the bills are getting paid and the house is getting cleaned and there's food in the refrigerator, etc. Looking at moderate intellectual disability, for individuals with this who will eventually be diagnosed at this level, it is possible to see delays earlier in the developmental period, so maybe during the preschool years. And then as they age, and this will be the case also with severe and profound intellectual disability, as individuals with these conditions age, we start to see greater and greater and greater separations in terms of the discrepancies in overall intellectual development and adaptive functioning between them and their age-matched, typically developing peers. Another characteristic of moderate intellectual disability is that they're more likely to have health and behavior problems than individuals who have a diagnosis of mild intellectual disability. And then lastly, looking at the severe and profound categories, we'll just consider them together. These are conditions that are generally identified at birth or shortly thereafter. So certainly the delays and the manifestations of the intellectual disability are so profound, are so fundamental that they kind of are affecting like these very early call them skills, if you could, at birth. Often accompanied by significant central nervous damage and may have additional disabilities or health conditions. So it's not necessarily just the intellectual disability. The more profound it gets, the greater the potential for contributing medical and neurological factors playing a part in the condition. So we'll now talk about the basically how intellectual disability affects a variety of domains that are certainly required to be successful in school, starting with cognitive functioning and learning. Joel already alluded to this, a slow learning rate. That is certainly one characteristic of people, students with intellectual disabilities. Generally, the speed or the rate at which they are able to learn information is well below that of their peers who do not have disabilities. And one way that this is determined is by this concept of trials to criterion. And so this is the number of practice or instructional trials needed before a student can answer a question correctly on their own without any kind of help from a teacher. So considering just a hypothetical example, you know, a child with a disability, without a disability might be able to learn to discriminate between a hexagon and a pentagon in 2 to 3 trials, let's say. Whereas a child with an intellectual disability might require 20 or 30 trials to make that same, to kind of become consistent in making that same discrimination between the 2 shapes. So certainly, much more concerted effort is required in order to help students with ID to, you know, acquire skills and knowledges that people without disabilities are able to often acquire very quickly. It has been proposed that since people with intellectual disabilities are so slow to learn, that it stands to reason that we should slow down instruction for them. But this actually has been shown not to be the case. And there is research that shows that students who have intellectual disabilities actually benefit more from participating in lively paced instruction and in situations when they have frequent opportunities to provide responses to questions. So it really isn't the case that we should, you know, in differentiated instruction, we really slow things down for the student with an intellectual disability.
You think it'd be more like you want to speak more simplistic, not slow down?
Right. So
they have more
probably more a matter of the language that you use and the approach that you use, exactly. But not just slowing things down.
Yeah. And the other thing too, you brought up behavior for, is that moderate?
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of the behavior stems from frustration.
Right. So
depending on what other disabilities they may have, they're simply just frustrated that they can't get it, or I don't know.
Right, or maybe they do know it, but they're not able to kind of formulate it or to, you know, kind of convey their understanding in the context of the classroom because of something that the teacher is doing. Memory, in general, the ability to just remember information is more difficult for students with intellectual disability. And this really plays out in working memory. So working memory being the ability to remember one thing while performing like another task. So being able to hold kind of multiple pieces of information in your mind at once and kind of, kind of work between them toward the end of solving some kind of problem. Short-term memory can also be impacted. Just the ability to recall and use information that was encountered, just a few seconds ago to a couple of hours earlier. And also students with ID can take longer to recall information, so to remember things that they've already learned. And they might have more difficulty handling larger amounts of cognitive information at one time. So this speaks to your comment that, yeah, maybe it's thinking about the kind of language that you're using and the amount of information that you are conveying through that language. That is kind of one factor of instruction that would need to be taken into consideration when attempting to, teach students with intellectual disabilities.
It's not saying too much either. So it's overwhelming.
Right, sticking to just kind of the important elements of what the student needs to know in order to solve the problem. And there are strategies for helping with improving memory. These are referred to as metacognitive or executive control strategies. So things like rehearsing, so like, repeating information that you want to remember over and over again. Coming up with ways to organize information into related sets to make things easier to remember. Often, students without disabilities can kind of come up with these strategies on their own, on the fly. But for many students with intellectual disabilities, that's not a kind of a spontaneous action. So it does need to be taught.
So and having routine.
Routine in the sense of?
So like their school schedule, having a set kind of routine that they know and they know what to expect.
Right.
That kind of goes for a lot of students in special ed.
Right, so that's going to reduce like the potential of disruptive or maladaptive behaviors or just anxiety getting in the way of learning.
Or forgetting where they're supposed to be going. I mean.
Right. And even a routine or a schedule can be useful to teaching some skills. And what I'm talking about here are task analysis approaches, where you're going to break down a very complex task into a series of smaller subtasks. And then that essentially kind of becomes like a schedule or a routine for accomplishing something. Certainly attention. Oftentimes, students with ID might be slower to attend to the relevant features of a task, or they might not attend to them all and instead be kind of distracted or focusing on stimuli that are irrelevant to solving the problem at hand.
Like a spinning fan.
Exactly, a spinning fan or
turned on fan, I should say, but yeah.
Yeah. Or maybe the teacher is wearing like a necklace or a brooch or something that's like kind of shiny, and so the student is just kind of paying attention to that and not really focusing on what the teacher has to say. It could be any number of things. Sustaining attention to learning tasks is another challenge. So that's essentially the ability to remain focused for a sustained amount of time in order to participate in the learning activity. And so basically these attentional deficits are going to have a compounding effect, and it's going to get in the way of acquiring, remembering, and also generalizing new knowledge and skills. And so kind of a good practice here is systematic control, okay, of basically coming up with ways that make kind of the important elements of a lesson or of a task kind of the most salient elements that are presented to the student, not, kind of, hiding them within a number of kind of extraneous, kind of irrelevant details. Even controlling the classroom environment if possible. Trying to reduce distractions, turning off the fans, for example, if a student, is distracted by something like that. So just one way of, of going about helping a student with an intellectual disability who might be suffering from kind of these attentional deficits to better engage and participate in the learning environment.
Helping them be more successful.
Exactly. Another challenge is generalization and maintenance. So generalization being the ability to transfer a skill, for example, learned in the classroom, into a setting where that skill is actually relevant. Basically, there are, ideally the best course of action is just to teach the skill in the environment in which the skill will need to be used, but that's not always the case. So there's not a lot of research here that, that has been, demonstrated to really improve generalization and maintenance for this population. But certainly kind of one, kind of obvious thing is if you're teaching, let's say you're working on counting change or something, or buying something at a grocery store, and, kind of, working through that whole transaction. Well, maybe in the classroom, if there's a life skills program or a classroom devoted to such skill development, you actually have a register and you try to just like do your best to kind of like mock up like a store or something, just so the student is going to kind of see at least some of the elements of the or features that they will encounter in the actual environment in which they will be required and expected to be able to use the skills. Motivation is another big factor. Some students might just seem uninterested in learning or in, problem-solving tasks in the classroom. And I mentioned this before, this idea of learned helplessness. This is referring to an individual's expectation of failure, regardless of their efforts, based on experiences of repeated failure. So, because I have failed so many times at, passing my math test, I'm just not even going to have any faith in my efforts to improve, just because experience has shown me that I will just always that I will always fail. And so that's just kind of how it's always going to be. This is another common situation that might arise. A problem-solving approach called outer directedness. And this can happen in situations where a student might become prompt dependent, right? Like throughout the student's life, his parents, teachers, instructional aides, just do things for the student, right? Maybe the student has some challenges or is expressing difficulties, so these individuals just end up just, doing whatever that task might be for the student. And so the student just kind of, learns through that experience that, well, every time I try to do this, my mom or my instructional aide just kind of jumps in and does it for me. So clearly I'm not doing it right. And so I'm just going to kind of let, this individual do this stuff for me from here on out. So this isn't necessarily, an inherent characteristic, this lack of motivation. It could just be an unintended byproduct of people doing things that they think are going to help the student, when in reality they might be creating a strong degree of dependence. So we need to be very kind of cautious of when, when we're providing prompts to support the completion of tasks, and kind of when we should be thinking about, kind of fading those prompts out. And so certainly learned helplessness, outer directedness, problem-solving approaches are just the opposite of self-determination, because in these situations students they don't have autonomy, they don't believe in their ability to set goals and to succeed at reaching those goals. And so really teaching students to take responsibility for their learning is an important component of self-determination that relates to kind of this motivation factor. Looking at self-care and daily living skills now. Most people who require extensive supports are going to be requiring support and basic self-care skills like dressing, eating, hygiene, maintenance of hygiene, certainly people who are more mildly affected can learn to take care of their basic needs, but they might benefit from training in self-management skills to achieve the levels of performance necessary for independent living and successful employment. So they can do these things, but they just kind of need some additional support to become more consistent in their self-management of them. We talked about social relationships, making and sustaining friendships. These present significant challenges for many students with intellectual disabilities. There are a number of factors that contribute to this. Poor communication skills, inability to recognize the emotional states of others, unusual or inappropriate behaviors when interacting with others can lead to social isolation. And so certainly for students with intellectual disability, IEP goals related to appropriate social and interpersonal skills should, be figuring prominently in their IEPs, because these are kind of one of the significant deficits that people with this condition experience. Behavioral excesses, challenging behavior. Students with this disability are more likely to exhibit behavior problems than children without disabilities. In general, the more severe, the more profound the intellectual disability, the higher the incidence and severity of the problem behavior. And these examples of these could be difficulty accepting criticism appropriately, limited behavioral self-control, aggression toward others, self-injury. And so certainly when we're talking about intellectual disability, these individuals can present with a huge range of characteristics. And what I've attempted to do here is just to kind of give a very broad stroke of some of the, the behaviors, learning, kind of learning characteristics, etc., that you would expect to see in students with this disability. But we should never leave out the positive attributes, because many children and adults with intellectual disability can be tenacious, they can be curious, they want to learn, and they're capable of learning, provided that they get the appropriate educational approaches to help them do so. And they can also be positive influences on those around them. So it's not like, you know, people with this disability are just characterized only by their challenges.
The student that I have in my class that
Huh?
has an intellectual disability, and I teach a behavior class, so most of my students would qualify for like tag. And I have one that has an intellectual disability, and he makes like the funniest jokes. Like his sense of humor, it was really fascinating because I didn't know, I had never worked with a student that had an intellectual disability. So when he came into my classroom, I was thinking like, I don't know what I'm getting myself into, but cool. And he's like exceeded all my expectations, which is good. I mean, for me to learn that, but also like the sense of humor is like cannot be matched in my room.
That's great. Yeah, and you know, that's certainly, you know, could be an angle that could be leveraged, you know, for helping that student, you know, kind of to make friends and establish relationships with his peers. So let's talk about some educational approaches for working with students with intellectual disabilities. I think these are important. It's important to kind of know and to be familiar with the characteristics that this disability presents with, but we also need to know, you know, what are the best ways of going about supporting these individuals in achieving their academic and functional goals in the context of school. And so I mentioned this earlier, traditionally students with intellectual disabilities might have received, you know, slowed down or watered down versions of general education curriculums that focus largely on traditional academic subjects. But as we are all well aware of, an educational curriculum that is focused primarily on traditional academics is not necessarily the right curriculum for all students. So when we're thinking about most students with intellectual disability, we should be thinking about functional academics. And these are basically the most useful parts of the traditional academic subjects, so reading, writing, math, and science. When we're thinking about kind of what functional academic skills we should be focusing on, well, these should be, you know, these should be informed by observation of a student's current routines. You know, what is the kid, what is the student good at? What does the student seem to struggle with? And so that's kind of in real time, but also it's important to consider the skills that were required by this student in the future, right? So that's knowing kind of what we, you know, what is this student going to eventually go to, like a kind of a day program for adults with disabilities? Is this individual going to live in like an assisted kind of living situation or a supported living situation? Is this individual going to, you know, work in like supported employment with a job coach? So it's not only critical to develop the skills that are necessary for success kind of in the immediate or in the, you know, the proximate time frame, but we must also be thinking about what's coming down the road. And I already alluded to this, complete immersion in a full academic curriculum can be restrictive and ineffective for students with intellectual disabilities. And it should not limit opportunities to learn the skills that they will need to function independently, both in their current and future environments. So why focus on functional curriculum? Well, functional curriculum content increases or has the potential to increase a student's independence There's self-direction, health, and fitness and enjoyment in all of kind of the common, community, home, school, and work settings that they will frequent. And as teachers, 2 questions that are helpful to ask in determining, whether a particular knowledge or skill is functional are presented here. Will this knowledge or skill help this kid to be more independent at home, at school, or in the community? There's a typo in this next one, I apologize. Will the failure to learn this knowledge or skill have negative consequences for the student? So these are like 2 good guiding questions, I could see them being useful for kind of, brainstorming about IEP objectives for not just a student with an intellectual disability, but a student with any disability, because that's really kind of what we're going for here, is to increase independence while they're in school, while at the same time focusing on skills that are going to increase independence in their future adult lives. And certainly self-determination, any kind of building self-determination into a functional curriculum is important. And there's one example here that I thought was important, and this is kind of for problem solving. This could certainly be relevant for problem solving in the classroom, problem solving in the community, problem solving at work. It's a self-regulated process that includes setting goals and then creating plans to address those. And so basically the student would be taught first to verbalize what is the problem, and then to actually say out loud what the problem is. And then the student would then be prompted to ask her or himself, well, what can I do about it? And then verbalize that solution. And then the student would be taught to implement this solution, and then to engage in a bit of self-reflection. Did my solution fix the problem? So a very kind of explicit approach and kind of almost, task analysis approach to problem solving. It's a generic strategy, so, in theory could be applied to any given number of situations and that a student might experience. When thinking about instructional methods, there's a lot here. Certainly we need to be aware of a student's present levels of performance. And that's because we want to prioritize and target, or prioritize and identify and prioritize the most important instructional targets. If possible, well, it's always possible to define a new knowledge or skill to be learned, but if it's possible, task analyze it, break that complex skill or piece of information into its component parts and teach those parts kind of on an individual basis. Design instructional materials and activities so the student has frequent opportunities to respond in the form of guided and independent practice. When using prompts and cues, always keep in mind that these things need to be faded away. We don't want the kid to become prompt dependent and to learn to rely on other people to solve her or his problems. Systematic consequences for student performance in the form of contingent reinforcement, instructional feedback, and error correction. Incorporate fluency building activities into lessons. Use strategies to promote the generalization and maintenance of newly learned skills. We've already talked about that briefly. And most importantly, conduct frequent measurements of student performance and use that data to inform instructional decisions. Now I'm curious if anyone would be willing to share the approaches that they use for measuring student performance in the classroom. Is it like a formalized system? Is it, does anyone not use measurement to determine if kind of what the approach you're using is effective or not?
We do a couple things in my room. We have Portland Public Schools is implementing this like standardized curriculum across all their sites. And so we have, like, for instance, everything is on grade level, and all the units are already developed, and it's up to teachers, like, specifically how they want to teach those units, but the standards, the priority standards are the same, and the content is pretty much the same. But each unit comes with a pretest, or a pre-assessment and a post-assessment. And so in combination with those, I just use work samples. And I teach in a behavioral, social, emotional classroom. So, depending, not all my kids are at grade level. In fact, very few are. Mm-hmm. But I still use that curriculum, at least to form a baseline of what kids already know. And then I haven't really used a lot of the post assessments because we're moving at a much slower pace than the rest of the school. So we're like just kind of finishing up unit 1 in literacy, for example, right now. So
okay. Does anyone else use measurement to determine the effectiveness of instructional approaches? Or
I use my district, on the IEP we have goals, and we have standardized goals. They are standards, but it's through a thing called Goal Book app. I don't know if anybody's used that. And so they're all associated with state standards. And since I'm not self-contained behavior, I'm like resource behavior. And so I'm teaching various strategies that are set, or strategies to meet goals that are set in their IEP for behavior or social skills. And so what I do is I'm sure some of you have seen like behavior tracking forms, but I've digitalized everything. So we just got a Verizon grant, and all of our students have iPads, and so I've created a digital tracking form for them. But instead of tracking their behavior like in each class, which I might do later, I'm tracking their goals. So I'm asking every single teacher, did they meet this goal today, so that I can track that data. And we use Microsoft Forms. I don't know if I said Google earlier, but it was Microsoft. And it prints it out in this, it like makes graphs out of it. So when parents call, or we have meetings, IEPs, or we have to send out progress reports, I send that out with it, and it has, so for instance, if a goal says like the student will take a 6-second pause before responding during a time when they feel frustrated. Mm-hmm. And so the question will be like, did the student take a 6-second pause before answering if they were frustrated today? And the teacher can say yes or no. And so I take that data, and I can see that progress over time, because I can export it all to an Excel file and track it, which is pretty cool.
And so I assume that if some students are, consistently not meeting their goals, that's useful information to kind of, set up a meeting with that teacher and kind of brainstorm, what's happening, what can be done differently in order to help a student. Or is it the case that most teachers say that their students are always achieving the goals?
No, I think it depends on the day, and the student has
that tracking form on their iPad. I think that the teachers are pretty honest about how the students are doing, and it helps me figure out if what I'm teaching them, my method of teaching is like kind of more fluid, because it's very difficult for me to sit down in a classroom, even with 4 or 5 students, and have them all be on the same topic, because they're all dealing with different traumas for the day. And so I often work one-on-one with them, even though I have a class full of students. It's like each person's working on something different. So anyway, no, it gives really good feedback, and it can, if I'm doing the right thing and if they're using those skills, and if not, we can review the skills I've taught them or pick a new skill and try that one. And it's really helpful data.
Excellent. Evidence-based procedures. That is the key. So lastly, the last thing that we'll talk about tonight is task analysis. And so again, this is another approach that is not only useful for students with intellectual disabilities, but you know, I used it a lot in my work with students with autism. So just this approach of breaking down complex and multi-step skills into smaller, easier to learn subtasks. And then, you know, you have 2 kind of approaches to go from there, or two options. Generally, you would, you know, work through the subtasks in sequential order, but it might not need to progress in that way. It could be that the nature of the kind of the larger task is such that, you know, you can do the kind of the easier tasks first, and then the more difficult tasks later. And this is very effective because you know, you get a good idea about, well, where, you know, instruction should begin. You know, if this student is, you know, if this task you know, has this larger order task has like 10 subtasks in it, and the kid's, you know, able to do tasks 1 through 5 independently, well, that shows me that, you know, I probably don't need to be focusing on those first 5 tasks, because the kid has them memorized. So it leads to a more effective use and focus of instruction. So that puts us at 6:56. I'm going to stop there. There were a few more slides that you can have a look at on your own that just go through a few more different strategies that have been shown to be effective for students with intellectual disability in the classroom. I'll put the slides on Canvas. I will get you the papers for 522. I promise that. I've downloaded them all. They're in my possession. I just need to email them. So be ready for those. Before I go, are there any questions or anything else? Thoughts? Insights? No? Okay. Excellent. Well, as always, thank you everyone for your patience, and I will be seeing you all next week.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.